a little bit of an introduction to anatomy and biology in general. So I organized this class in terms of organ systems, in terms of like circulatory system, digestive system, nervous system, but this is not the only level of organization at which you can look at things. So there are much more smaller scales too. So for example, on the scales of organelles, does anyone know what an organelle is? Have a guess? Or maybe looking at these images, which one of these do you think represents an organelle? You can feel free to annotate on the screen too. And circle which one you think it is. See, oh, yes, I see some people circling one of them. Yeah, this one. Good. Yeah, so organelles. This is a great example of an organelle. It's a mitochondria, and it's the powerhouse of the cell. And organelles are basically small little compartments within a cell that perform specialized functions. So it helps the cell get organized and separate different materials that should not be mixing, separating different processes that need to be separated. So that's one level we can look at it. We can also look on it on the level of a cell, which like I said, is going to be the larger container in which the organelles are found. So which one of these do you think is a cell? See someone circling this one. This is not a cell. Oh, yeah. See a couple people circling.
Is that a heart?
Yeah, it is a heart, the circled one. It is. Nice job.
Is it an organelle?
The heart is not an organelle. So the heart, we'll get there like really soon, but organelles and organs, very important to differentiate between those, although we won't really be talking much about organelles because they're too small for the scale of anatomy that anatomy usually looks at. So yeah, a couple people circled this. This is, yeah, the typical image of an animal cell. And you can see each of these small things within it is an organelle. They're color-coded. So the cell contains lots of organelles. And in turn, cells can group together to form tissues, which are basically like sort of masses of connected cells that all serve a sort of similar function. So which one of these images do you think represents a tissue? Yeah, a couple people circling this one. Yeah, this is a tissue. Specifically, it is actually cardiac muscle. So very relevant to our topic today, which is the circulatory system. But yeah, this is the image of an image of a heart muscle tissue. So you can see each of these little circles is like the nucleus in the cell, and these cells are all really interwoven and connected with each other to form the sheet of muscle that is going to make up the heart. And the next level organization is going to be organs. So within organs, you have lots of tissues coming together to kind of serve a larger function. So the heart over here, like Eleanor pointed out earlier, this is a heart. This is an actual heart, not like a schematic or an image or a drawing of a heart. That is going to be an organ, and lots of different types of tissues come in together to form the heart. It's not just muscle. There's also connective tissue and epithelial tissue, like kind of skin-like protective coverings and things like that, that all come together to form a singular function, which is pump blood throughout your body. All right, and finally, organ systems. So this is how each week is going to be based off of. So within organ systems, you have lots of organs typically being involved to do an even larger function. So transporting nutrients and oxygen to all parts of your body is a function of the circulatory system, which is the last image here that we see. All right, so that's just an introduction to kind of different levels that we can look at anatomy in biology. In anatomy, we're not going to be looking too much on the cell level and not really on the organelle level. We're going to be very focused on the organ systems, the organs, and what each of the organs do within the organ system to kind of to serve that larger purpose that the organ system as a whole can do. And obviously, once you put these all together, you get an organism like us, humans, animals, plants are all organisms. All right. So circulatory system is the focus of today. And within the human body, there are actually kind of two major circuits of blood flow. So it's not one giant loop, there's actually two loops. So I've provided for you here a diagram representing this circulatory system. So based on this, can someone tell me what are the names of the two circulation systems? The names can be found on this diagram. You can type in chat or you can speak out loud. And you can also private message me the answer if you're not comfortable. If you're not comfortable typing to everybody. So someone said here, vena cava and aorta. So those are definitely two very important parts of the circulatory system in the two different circulation systems. Those are not actually the names of the two circulations though. What I was looking for here is these. These are in the centers of these two circles. So there's a lot of extra words here. These are all names of structures within these circuits, but the actual circuits themselves are called pulmonary. The pulmonary circuit, this is spelled wrong. And the systemic circulation. So pulmonary is this top loop. You can visualize it as being, like starting here, going there, going in the circle, and then ending back in the heart. And the other circuit is also gonna be in the heart, go through here, loop downwards, and end up back in the heart as well. So based on this image, what do you think the function is of each of these two systems, or give similarities and differences between each of these? What do you think they are? So what's one observation you can make?
One is red, one is blue.
Yes, there are different colors on this diagram. There is actually red and blue in both of these circuits. So you'll notice this circuit, it starts red and turns blue. And this circuit, it starts red, or it starts blue and it turns red. So first of all, what do we think the red and blue represents? Yeah, go ahead.
Oxygenated and deoxygenated blood.
Yeah, so the blue, the blood that is depicted as blue in the image is going to be deoxygenated blood. Yeah, exactly. It's going to be really low in oxygen. And the oxygenated blood is going to be really rich in oxygen. And so basically what we can see from this in terms of the differing functions of these two systems is in the pulmonary circulation, you start blood as deoxygenated. It's really poor in oxygen. It doesn't have a lot of it, but it's going to go through the lungs. And as you know, you breathe in and out, you're going to breathe in oxygen and kind of replenish your supply of oxygen. And that oxygen is going to go into the bloodstream and oxygenate this blood as the blood is passing through the lungs. So what you end up with is oxygenated blood, and it flows back to the heart. So a brief description of the function of the pulmonary circulation would be that it sends blood through the lungs to get rid of CO2 and become rich in oxygen, and then it pushes it back to the heart. So then in contrast, we see that the systemic circulation starts oxygenated. So this starts as a red color. So we just came back from the lungs, right? Our blood is oxygenated, and it's going to flow in this loop and go all over the body. It's going to be sent to all of the body tissues, which is just represented as an image of a person here. And as it goes to all these tissues really need oxygen, right? Every part of our body needs oxygen to function, and is going to be producing CO2 that needs to be breathed out as a waste product. So in these this should be body tissues. In these body tissues, the oxygen is going to be exchanged so that the oxygen goes into the tissues, and the carbon dioxide produced by the tissues is going to come into the bloodstream. The blood is going to become deoxygenated, which means it's low in oxygen. So we're going to represent it as blue over here. And then all of this blood from all over the body is going to be sent back into the heart, completing our systemic circulation. And these processes that occur in the lungs and the body tissues are collectively called gas exchange, which just means that, like the name implies, gas is being exchanged. So oxygen and carbon dioxide are moving locations. In the lungs, it means that the oxygen is going to be going into the bloodstream, and carbon dioxide is going to be leaving the bloodstream, going into your lungs, and eventually exhaled. And then gas exchange in the body tissues is going to be opposite. So instead of oxygen going into the bloodstream, it's going to be carbon dioxide going into the bloodstream, and oxygen leaving the bloodstream, going into your body tissues, which are the cells that need it. So in summary, can somebody give a kind of maybe just one observation of what one similarity or difference is between these two systems of circulation, the pulmonary circulation and systemic circulation, that they remember from what we just discussed?
The pulmonary circulation, it takes deoxygenated blood and it adds oxygen to it. And in the systemic circulation, it takes oxygenated blood and sends it to the tissues and then comes out deoxygenated.
Yeah, very nice summary. Yeah, those are exactly what these two systems will do. Good. Okay. Now we'll talk about the structure of the heart. So the heart is probably the most important organ within the circulatory system, since it's kind of like the central hub of everything. It's going to be pumping blood to your lungs as well as pumping blood to every part of your body. So the basic structure of it is that it's going to have 4 chambers and 4 valves. So the 4 chambers, we're going to have 2 smaller chambers on the top here, which are called atria or atrium, which is the singular form. And then we are also going to have 2 larger chambers on the bottom, which are going to be called ventricles. So 2 atria and 2 ventricles, and you have 1 atrium and 1 ventricle on the left and right side of your heart. So if you divided the heart in half, you could see on this left side, it's going to be, has 1 atrium and 1 ventricle. On the right also has 1 atrium, 1 ventricle. The left and rights might look a little strange to you on this diagram, and that's because when we talk about left and right in anatomy, it's always from the perspective of the person who owns the organ. So when we look at this image, we're looking at it we'd be facing the person that owns this heart. But for the person that owns this heart, the left and right are going to be swapped, if you can imagine kind of looking downward on your own heart. So what this seems like as the right side is actually going to be called the left. So everything over here is referred to as left. And then what actually seems like the left side is going to be actually the right. So that's a little confusing, but that's how we refer to things in anatomy. And some other notable features of the heart is these giant blood vessels flowing out of it. So we have one giant blood vessel, the aorta, which is this huge, thick vessel that basically is going to be sending blood all over your body. And we also have the pulmonary artery, which is going to be sending blood to your lungs. The word pulmonary means lungs. So if you hear pulmonary, think lungs. The pulmonary arteries are going to be sending blood to the lungs. And there are 4 valves within the heart as well that are going to be kind of separating or connecting these chambers and blood vessels. So we're going to have a valve between each of the 2 pairs of atria and ventricles. So between the right atrium and the right ventricle, there's going to be one valve called the tricuspid valve. It's one of the atrioventricular valves. And what valves do, you can essentially think of them as a one-way door. So they can open one way and let blood through that way, but they will not let blood through the other way, which is really important because we only want blood to flow in one direction in this circle. Otherwise, it's going to go, if it flows back and forth, if it can flow in whatever direction it wants, then it will never get to where it needs to be. So these valves are very important in ensuring that blood flows in only one direction. If you can remember that, that's the purpose of valves. And so this valve in between the right atrium and right ventricle is going to be basically ensuring that blood only flows from the atrium into the ventricle and not the other way around. Similarly, you're going to have kind of the same thing on the left side. So you're going to have another valve called the mitral valve, which separates the left atrium and the left ventricle. And it also ensures that blood only flows from the atrium into the ventricles, never the other way. If it's flowing the other way, there is something wrong with your heart, and that actually becomes a very serious health problem. All right, so I mentioned that there's 4 valves though, not just 2. I've only talked about 2 valves so far. Where do we think the other 2 valves are? Can anyone point them out on the diagram? Feel free to draw. Which of these words also has valve in it? So we've already talked about this valve. And we've already talked about this valve. Yeah, okay, I guess they didn't mark them separately, but yeah, the semilunar valves, exactly. So the semilunar valves, there's 2 of them. And one of them is going to be separating the pulmonary artery from the right ventricle, and the other one is going to be separating the left ventricle from the aorta. So essentially, these valves also do the same thing. They make sure blood only flows from the heart into these arteries, which are moving away from the heart and not the other way around. So yep, here we're going to have the pulmonary valve, and here we're going to have the aortic valve. And the reason they're called semilunar valves is actually based on the shape of the valve. So as you can imagine, each of the valves is overall going to be circular because these arteries are circular and the heart is roughly spherical-ish. So the reason they're called that is because, the flaps that kind of make up the valves are going to be kind of divided into kind of this shape. So yeah, that's why they're called semilunar and not some other name. Okay, another interesting feature of the heart is that it's not just all muscle, it's actually going to have a covering to it. So Word breakdown, pericardium. Peri means around. That's what that prefix means. And cardium means the heart. So remember when I said pulmonary means lungs, cardium is going to be always referring to the heart. So just look at an anatomy. If you ever see these like root words, like cardium, cardiac, cardiovascular, all having to do with the heart. So peri, around, cardium, the heart. So the pericardium is going to be found around the heart, which is exactly what it is. It's a protective covering of the heart. You can see there's kind of many layers that make up the pericardium, but within it, you're going to have this kind of gap, as you can see here, and it's going to be filled with serous fluid, which is just a type of bodily fluid that essentially lubricates the heart. So that it's protective and when it's moving around doesn't have a lot of friction. So then the heart has protective membranes that lubricate it. We just talked about it, the pericardium, but I'll tell you right now that the kidneys don't have something similar to this. Why do you think the kidneys don't have this while the heart does need this? What do you know about the functions or what the kidneys versus the heart does that can give you some information about why you might need some lubrication and protective membranes over the heart, but not the kidneys? Does anybody have any ideas? It's okay to guess. We're not judging even if you're wrong, and we love to hear any ideas. If you'd like to type in the chat as well, that is fine too. You can type directly to me so only I can see your answer. Or you can type it to everyone if you feel more comfortable doing that. I'll give you a hint. So the reason that the heart has protective membranes, it has this lubrication because it's always moving. It's moving a lot. Your heart is constantly beating and pulsing and squeezing to send blood all over your body. And so it's going to be rubbing against everything around it a lot and in general moving a lot, creating a lot of friction. Do the kidneys do that? Do the kidneys beat and pulse around and kind of in general make a ruckus around in the body? What do you think? Based on what you know about the kidneys. Well, maybe I should make a poll. Oops. Nope, bad idea. I'm too unexperienced with Zoom to make a poll right off the bat here. That's okay, we'll just do this. So the kidneys, they do not actually move around a lot. They're just sitting there. The kidneys kind of cleanse your blood and filter out bad things, and they create urine. They're not going to be moving around a whole lot. There's just blood flowing through it, but the kidneys themselves, the kidneys aren't squeezing or contracting or doing anything like that, like the heart is. So the kidneys do not need these protective membranes that the heart has to kind of lubricate for its movement, but the heart does. So then a follow-up question to that is, do you think the lungs would have these membranes? So based on what you know about the lungs, what do your lungs do? Are they constantly moving? If you think yes, you can put up a thumbs up or something, do a reaction on Zoom if you know how to do that. Or alternatively, just like select yes or no here. Yes, no. See someone typed yes, I see someone typed maybe. Yeah, so the lungs do in fact have these membranes. So as you know, your lungs, those are the things you're using for breathing. So you're breathing in, your lungs are expanding, and when you're breathing out, your lungs are contracting and they're filling with air and constantly kind of moving around, changing their shape and like rubbing against the heart as well. So they're doing a lot of movement, and we're going to want to kind of protect those as well and lubricate their movement. So yep, the lungs do have membranes similar to the pericardium that the heart has. And we'll talk a little bit about that in our week on the respiratory system too. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the flow of blood through the heart, which is probably one of the more confusing concepts in the circulatory system because there's just so many words. So here I've listed out kind of, it's a really long list, I'm sorry, of kind of all the components that blood is going to be flowing through in the heart, or one of them is just the bodies, various veins and arteries. Before we do this activity, I'd like to tell you guys about the difference between arteries and veins. So it's a common misconception that arteries are all oxygenated blood and that veins are all deoxygenated blood, because we always see arteries shown as red and veins shown as blue. But the actual definition of an artery is that it's going to be moving away from the heart. So like the pulmonary arteries, for example, they are moving away from the heart, so therefore they are considered arteries, but they're not carrying oxygenated blood, as you will notice. So they are actually depicted as blue here and are deoxygenated, low in oxygen, which is why we're sending it to the lungs. We're sending it to the lungs to get more oxygen to be able to send to the rest of the body. So arteries just means away from the heart. A for away. Veins are going to be coming back towards the heart, and that's how you can kind of separate those. So each of these components is labeled on this diagram. So mitral valve is here, right atrium here. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to say let's start right here. So superior inferior vena cava is going to be number 1. Where do we think we go after that? So the superior vena cava is here, this large vein, and the inferior vena cava is going to be down here, and it's another large vein. Where do they lead to? Where do we think? You can type in chat or talk or anything. Yeah, someone typed, since they're blue, they're carrying deoxygenated blood. This is true. This is true. And since we're not passing through the lungs yet, oh, I see someone typed left atrium. So close, so close. So the next step is actually going to be the right atrium, the other side. So right here, oh, you meant right. Yep, that is correct. So it is going to be the right atrium. So you can see from the image, this vein empties directly into this chamber. And so does this bottom one. It's kind of blocked by the rest of the image, but it does go into the right atrium. So now we're in the right atrium. Great. Our deoxygenated blood is in the right atrium. and we want to go to the right ventricle. So, but before we go to the right ventricle, what valve do we have to pass through?
Atrioventricular valve.
Yeah, it's going to be one of the atrioventricular valves, specifically the tricuspid valve right here as it's labeled. So after the right atrium, we're going to pass through the tricuspid valve and go into the, where's the right ventricle? Right here, right ventricle. Great. After the right ventricle, where do we think we're going to go? So the right ventricle is right here. We know we can't go back through this tricuspid valve because remember, valves only allow blood to flow in one direction. What's the other exit from this chamber? Yeah, semilunar valves. Very good. Yeah, so we're going to go through one of the semilunar valves, and specifically this one is going to be the pulmonary valve. So, oops, I cleared it. But the next option, the next place we're going is the pulmonary valve. So after the pulmonary valve, where does that lead to? We go from the right ventricle through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary arteries. So we're going into the pulmonary arteries now. Pulmonary arteries is going to go away from your heart, and pulmonary, remember pulmonary means lungs. So the next stop after that, yeah, we're going to go to the lungs. Exactly. Someone typed it in chat. Into the lungs. So in the lungs, we're going to perform the gas exchange. Remember, oxygen is going to go into the bloodstream and carbon dioxide is going to flow out. And so what we're going to end up with is oxygenated blood. So when we come back to the heart, it's important to remember that now we're going to end up with oxygenated blood. It's going to be colored red on our diagrams. So if we're coming back from the lungs and we're going back towards the heart, where do we think, which part of this do we think is going to be involved with doing that? What thing is going to send blood from the lungs back towards the heart? Aorta. Aorta is oxygenated, yep. So it is not going to be the aorta though. The aorta is going to serve a different function really soon. But coming back from the lungs, remember pulmonary means lungs. So looking for that word pulmonary is going to help us a lot. And remember, coming back towards the heart, we're going to be coming back in veins. Veins come towards the heart. Arteries go away. A for arteries, and A for away, and aorta, also an artery. So once we go to the lungs, we're going to come back in these pulmonary veins. And once we're in the pulmonary veins, we're going to end up in the left atrium with our oxygenated blood. So the left pulmonary veins and the right pulmonary veins, that just means coming from the right lungs or left lungs, come into our chamber of the heart, the left atrium. And from the left atrium, where do we think we're going to go from there? Yes, mitral valve. Very good. Yes, we're going to pass through the mitral valve. And this is going to then lead to the left ventricle. So we're going to go through the left atrium, pass through the mitral valve, go into the left ventricle, and then we're going to go to the aorta, like we were talking about. The aorta, this gigantic blood vessel. It's so huge and so powerful. It's going to go through another one of the semilunar valves that is kind of hidden here behind the pulmonary artery. It's going to go through this valve and into the aorta and go all throughout the body and eventually come back to our vena cava veins. So that's kind of the full circuit. And it's okay if you didn't catch all of that. It was quite a lot and kind of complicated, but just always remember and think about our two circulation systems. So we're going to go from the heart to the lungs and come back to the heart, and then we're going to leave the heart again, go to the entire body, and then come back to the heart again. You're going to kind of make these two loops, and that can help guide you in kind of trying to figure out what goes where within the heart. Another rule that you can always think about is that blood is always going to flow from the atrium into the ventricles and from the ventricles out of the heart. So always atrium to ventricles, no other direction. And the valves make sure of that. This is the entire list, the kind of ordering of the entire cycle of the flow of blood through your circulatory system if you want to review it. It is quite a lot to take in, I know. But if you're interested in reviewing, it will be available there. All right, so I'm gonna skip this for a moment and do this first, and then we can talk about that if we have time. So one common thing used to kind of give information about how your heart is doing, and it's a very common like vital sign used by doctors when they're trying to diagnose what you have or just make sure in general you're doing okay, is the ECG or the AEKG, which is basically essentially the measure of the electrical signals in your heart that kind of make up your heartbeat. So when doctors do an EKG on you, put an EKG on you and measure your heartbeats, it's going to look like this if you have a normal heartbeat. So each of these kind of like spasms or little jumps in this line is going to be one heartbeat. So when you hear in like TV shows, I don't know if you've heard of like people flatlining like this, they're talking about EKGs. So I can't draw a straight line, sorry guys. But they're going to be, if they have a straight line, that's really bad because that means their heart isn't beating at all. And that means they're probably dead. Or like kind of close to being dead. So that's what that means. And in addition, I'm not going to explain specifically what each of these are, but when your heart contracts, when your heart beats, it squeezes, right? And it squeezes blood to your lungs and to your body. It doesn't squeeze everything in the heart at once. You're actually going to squeeze in two steps, which is your atrium for atria first. Remember those two smaller chambers on the top of your heart, and then you squeeze the ventricles, the two larger chambers on the bottom. So when you have your heartbeat, it can be kind of divided into two stages. So out of each heartbeat, we're just going to separate this out here for a sec. This first little bump you see is going to correspond to the atrial contraction. So those two little chambers on the top of your heart are going to be contracting first. That is atrial contraction, and that's represented on this graph by this little line, by this little bump. And then you have your gigantic ventricles contracting. They're very strong and powerful and need a larger electrical signal. You see this huge spike that is going to be your ventricular contraction. So the bottom part of your heart contracting is represented by this big spike. So in a heartbeat, you have the top contracting first and then the bottom contracting in very quick succession. And then this other bump here is basically the heart resetting itself to its normal state in preparation for the next beat. So those are the kind of parts of an EKG. And this is what it looks like. This is what an EKG looks like if your heart is completely normal, beating correctly, and you're super healthy. This is what you want to see. So now let's talk a little bit about things you don't want to see. So one thing that is not good at all is bradycardia. So bradycardia, let's break down this word. It's kind of a strange word, but it has two parts that you can kind of think of it in terms of. So brady means slow, cardia means heart. So what do we think bradycardia means?
A heart that's beating slow.
Yeah, exactly. It's a heart that's beating too slowly, so below the normal amount of regular heartbeats per minute, which is around 80 for normal people. So what do we think the EKG is going to look like here? How is this going to be different from the previous one? And as a reminder, here, as we move along to the right in this graph, it's corresponding to time passing. So what do we think is going to look different in this EKG versus the last one? We know the heart is beating slower.
So just a longer length between the mountain thingies that go up and down.
Yeah, exactly. So we're gonna see greater separation between each of these heartbeats that we saw. So like we're gonna see these heartbeats, but they're gonna be kind of a lot farther apart than they were before. So let me go to the next slide. Yep, this is kind of what it looks like. It's a little bit hard to tell, but these are actually a lot further apart than let me scroll backwards, the normal sinus rhythm. So you can see 1, 2, there's only like kind of 1.5 of a empty line between each of these, versus here we have like almost 3. So you're basically doubling the time between each heartbeat, which is really bad. If your heart is beating too slowly, then you're not able to recycle nutrients and oxygen and waste products throughout your blood properly. Things can build up, you're not getting enough oxygen, all sorts of problems. So bradycardia, very not good. So doctors can diagnose that with an EKG. They measure your heartbeats using this EKG. They will be able to see if your heart is beating too slowly, and they can see exactly how it is. And they can also just take your pulse, but this gives a better visual representation. Here's another example. Tachycardia. Tachy means fast, cardia means heart. What do we think tachycardia is?
Heart beats too fast.
Yeah, exactly. And the heart is beating too fast. So it's kind of the opposite of bradycardia. So how do we think the EKG for this one is going to look compared to the normal EKG?
Maybe the waves will be smaller and very frequent.
Yeah, they are going to be very frequent, yes. So there's going to be a lot less separation between each of these now. So it might even look like this. This is very fast. I'm not drawing the lines very well, but you get the idea. Sinus tachycardia. You see it's beating very frequently, much more frequently than we saw before. Almost right after one another, the separation between each wave is almost negligible. I'm circling the difference right here. All right. And then one more example, atrial fibrillation. This is a little different from the ones we've talked before. Fibrillation is kind of like an irregular, really rapid sort of heartbeat that's kind of, you can think of it as like the heart is like kind of shaking, like spasming almost. It's very irregular, and as you can probably tell, very bad, because when you're in fibrillation, you're not really pumping blood that effectively. So atrial fibrillation, remember what atria are? What are atria in terms of the heart? can type it in the chat or speak it out loud. Does anyone remember what an atrium is? Remember, it's part of the heart. So remember, we have 4 chambers of the heart. 2 of them are atria.
So where the blood enters the heart?
Yeah, it is where the blood enters the heart. Yeah, very good. They're going to be on the top. Yeah. So remember, we had these 2 top chambers and then 2 bottom chambers that are larger. The 2 top ones are going to be atria. 2 bottom ones are ventricles. So atria is referring to these first 2, these smaller chambers that are going to be beating first. And they are spasming. They're just going wild, kind of pumping and contracting really irregularly. So what do we think is going to happen to the EKG here? Do we think it's going to look really irregular too?
What does fibrillation even mean?
Yeah, so fibrillation is basically a really rapid, irregular heartbeat.
Well, I guess the heartbeat's going to be irregular.
Yeah, so it's going to look really strange and like kind of just like a bunch of random stuff happening. Yeah, someone said tiny little bumps, exactly. So what it actually looks like here, exactly, tiny little bumps. But you'll notice, because it's atrial fibrillation, there actually is still these spikes here that corresponds to the ventricles. The ventricles are still contracting well, and they're doing well, but the atria specifically are doing really poorly. So what you should have seen is a nice little atrium bump and then a nice regular ventricle bump and then the next one. But instead you see the atria just bumping really irregularly with the ventricle kind of once in a while doing its regular thing. Is there ventricular fibrillation? Yes, there is. There is ventricular fibrillation as well. And it looks a little different from this though. But yep, there is ventricular fibrillation, which is almost worse than atrial fibrillation. All right, so let's do a little bit of review and then we'll stop for today. What valve connects the left atrium to the left ventricle? Might be a little bit hard to memorize, so I'll pull up the image for you guys again. What valve is between the left atrium and the left ventricle? Someone said tricuspid, really close. Tricuspid is so similar to this one. On the other side of the heart though, what's the one on the other side of the heart? Mitral, yes, awesome job. It is the mitral valve. So, yep, connecting the left atrium, left ventricle, you have the mitral valve right here, which is one of the atrioventricular valves, one of the valves connecting the atria and ventricles. What chamber of the heart would blood returning through the pulmonary vein enter through first? So we're coming back from the lungs, we're going through the pulmonary vein. Where do we go? We're coming through the pulmonary veins over here and over here. It's gonna go right here. What is this one called? Left atrium. Yes, this is the left atrium. Good. And we didn't talk about, well, let's talk about a little bit of this. We'll talk a little bit about the microcirculation. So microcirculation, what does micro mean? Does anyone know what this prefix micro means?
Very small.
Small.
Yeah, small. Micro means small. So microcirculation is kind of the smaller aspects of the circulation. So we talked about this ginormous structure, the heart, and all of the giant veins and arteries coming off of it, like the aorta and the pulmonary veins and the pulmonary arteries. But not everything in the circulatory system is as large as that. In fact, it's going to be a lot smaller. So as blood is traveling throughout our body, it's going to change or the blood vessels are going to change in their properties and size. So for arteries, remember as we're leaving the heart, so heart over here, we're leaving the heart, we're going to be going out in arteries. And these arteries, they're pretty large, so it's not going to be able to go everywhere in your body. In order to go into every kind of nook and cranny and crevice in your body, they're going to have to get smaller. They're going to branch out and become kind of mini arteries called arterioles. And these arterioles, they're smaller than arteries, but they're actually pretty big too. So they are going to become even smaller, keep branching out, becoming thinner and thinner and more numerous until they become these super, super thin blood vessels called capillaries. Capillaries are actually only 1 cell thick, and this is where the actual gas exchange occurs. So in these capillaries, oxygen is going to be leaving, carbon dioxide is going to be coming in. This is the systemic circulation. And in the pulmonary circulation, it would be the opposite direction. But in these capillaries, gas exchange occurs. That is where gas exchange occurs. And after the capillaries, we've done all that. And now we just need to gather up the blood and get back to the heart. So what we're going to do is start branching and connecting and merging all of these vessels together to form larger venules, which are kind of mini veins, which then converge and join together to form actual veins. And the microcirculation is important because this is actually what brings blood in a really close to and intimate with the cells, all the cells in your body. So that's how we actually access all of the nutrients, not just like this large heart that is kind of far away from really most of the cells in your body. Okay, so we didn't get through this slide today, but if you're interested, you can look at this later and kind of think about why these variables might change like this through the microcirculation. And we also didn't talk about the electrical system of the heart and each of the parts of it. But if you're interested, these are what they are. And you can look into kind of how electrical signals are conducted throughout the heart. We talked about how blood is flowing through the heart, but not electrical signals. And yeah,